Peppa Pig, the box of drawings. It started on a quiet morning. Peppa woke up to a rustling sound. George was dragging something along the floor. In the hallway, she saw him carrying a cardboard box. Old, dusty, no writing on it. It looked like something forgotten in a basement. "Where did you get that?" Peppa asked. George didn't answer. He just smiled. He placed the box on the floor and opened it. Inside were drawings, dozens, some on torn scraps of paper, others fresh and colorful, all drawn by a child's hoof. "Did you draw these?" George stayed silent. The first drawing was simple. Peppa standing in the kitchen, a broken cup on the floor, Daddy with a broom, Mummy holding a rag. A few hours later, it happened, exactly like in the drawing, down to the smallest detail. Peppa dropped a cup, shards scattered. Daddy sighed. Mummy got the rag. "Just a coincidence," Mummy said. But George pulled out the next drawing. It showed their garden, a ball stuck in the tree, Daddy holding a ladder, Peppa reaching up. The next day the ball really did get stuck, in the same place, exactly like the drawing. Peppa started going through the drawings. The further she went, the darker they became. The colors, duller, the figures, twisted. One showed Peppa's room at night. At the window, a silhouette. Faceless. Peppa shoved it to the bottom of the box. But that night she woke up, went to the window. For a moment, she thought someone had just stepped out of view. Another drawing, the bathroom, the mirror, Peppa's reflection smiling, even though she wasn't. Another one, George sleeping, and beside his bed stood a second George, identical, but with red crayon eyes. Peppa hid the box in the closet, but George found it again. He said, "I have to keep watching." Every day, new drawings appeared, even though no one was drawing. One morning, at the very top of the pile, was a picture of that exact breakfast. The tablecloth, the cup, the toast, all correct. At the edge, a drop. Peppa thought it was paint, but it was tea. Then came a drawing of the living room. Daddy asleep in his chair, and behind him, someone reaching toward his shoulder. That evening, Daddy flinched. He said, "I thought someone touched me." But the room was empty. At last, Peppa found the final drawing. It was black and white. It showed herself, standing alone in an empty room. No windows, no toys. Her face, blank, arms limp at her sides, and behind her, the box, and written in neat handwriting, "Now you're inside." That night, Peppa woke up. The room felt unusually dark, too quiet. On the floor, the box, empty. All the drawings were gone. Only one remained. It lay on top. It showed Mummy, Daddy, and George sitting at the table, smiling, laughing. But Peppa wasn't there, and at the bottom, written carefully, "They don't remember you anymore." The night was unusually quiet. Outside the window, there were no stars, no moon, only a dense darkness in which everything seemed to dissolve. Peppa Pig's house had fallen silent on its own. Even the kitchen clock had stopped ticking, and the silence was so heavy it felt like it was pressing against their ears. Peppa woke up suddenly, as if someone had touched her shoulder. She sat up in bed and listened to George's breathing. It was too even, too quiet. Her brother slept, tightly clutching his dinosaur. But then, from the parents' room next door, came a sound. A low, drawn-out groan mixed with a creaking noise. Peppa held her breath. She hadn't wanted to wake George, but he opened his eyes himself and looked at her. His face was pale. He had heard it too. Carefully, they got out of bed and, trying to walk silently, stepped into the hallway. There was no moonlight, only a faint flicker coming from under their parents' door. That was where the strange sound was coming from. Peppa squeezed George's little paw. The door was slightly ajar. She nudged it open just a little and peeked inside. What they saw froze their hearts. On the bed sat a creature that resembled their parents, yet was entirely alien. Its body looked as if it had been stitched from two halves. One part, Mummy Pig, the other, Daddy Pig. Two heads protruded side by side, but the eyes in both faces were utterly empty. They reflected no light, no life, only two bottomless black voids. Identical, wide smiles stretched across both faces. The creature turned toward the children, the two heads tilted at the same time. With that movement, the very air seemed to change pressure. It became harder to breathe. Peppa stepped back, but her legs refused to obey. George clutched her paw tightly, but he too seemed rooted to the floor. The creature stretched its arms toward them. The fingers were too long, the joints bent at unnatural angles. The room reeked of dampness and rot.
Mama!
Whispered Peppa. But in that moment she knew it was not their parents. Their bodies began moving on their own. Slowly, step by step, they walked toward the thing. Their hearts pounded, but there was no strength left to resist. The creature waited. Its two mouths opened and closed in perfect unison, but no sound came out. And that silence was more terrifying than any scream. And then, from behind it, from the very shadow, he appeared. Labubu. Peppa recognized his silhouette instantly, her favorite toy, the one that always sat on the shelf. But now, he was alive. His movements were jerky, like a puppet pulled by invisible strings. His red eyes glowed in the dark, and on his face was a smile so wide and crooked it looked as though the fabric would split. In his paws, he held a doll. Small, ragged, and horribly familiar. A copy of Peppa herself. Even the dress was the same pink, only stained with dark blotches. Slowly, Labubu began to pull at the doll's head. The fabric stretched, and a sickening tearing sound filled the air. The two-headed creature immediately froze, as if awaiting orders. Its empty eyes were fixed on Labubu. It wasn't the master, it was the servant. "No," whispered Peppa, but her voice was too weak. George flinched, his small eyes widening. On the floor beside him lay another doll, an exact copy of George. It had appeared out of nowhere, and its lifeless eyes stared directly at the children. Labubu lifted his gaze. His red eyes met Peppa's. In that instant, she felt the world itself shift. The walls of her parents' bedroom quivered, the ceiling stretched higher, and the door behind her slammed shut on its own. There was no way out. The creature took a step forward, its two heads grinning in the same unnatural smile. But it wasn't moving toward the children. It was moving in rhythm with Labubu. Every tilt of his head, every twitch of his paw was mirrored by the monster. It was the puppet, and Labubu was the puppeteer. Peppa and George screamed, but their voices vanished, swallowed by the air itself. Labubu only smiled wider. He lifted both dolls, the Peppa doll and the George doll, and pressed them together. At that moment, the children felt their own bodies being dragged forward, pulled into the darkness toward the creature. The darkness closed in around them. Peppa had just enough time to see Labubu's red eyes blazing brighter than ever. And then the world was gone. The last thing that remained in her memory was his smile, and the realization that now they themselves had become part of Labubu's collection.
Peppapig, the mask. It began on a cold, windy day, the kind of wind that pulled at trees and scattered wet leaves across the pavement. The sky had been grey for many days, the park was empty, and the paths were soggy. Peppa and George were walking along a muddy path. Leaves stuck to their boots, and the ground squelched beneath them. Then Peppa saw a white shape lying in the grass. A mask. It lay perfectly flat, as if placed there on purpose. Not fallen, not forgotten. Face up, white, smooth, featureless. Just two dark slits for eyes, and a thin line where a mouth should be, not a smile. Peppa stopped. She bent down, touched it with her hoof. The mask was dry, not cold, as if it had been waiting for her. She pressed it to her face. The mask stuck, silently, effortlessly. At first it seemed like a game, but the mask wouldn't come off. Her hooves slid along the surface, finding no edge, no straps, no seams, nothing. She tugged, pulled harder. It didn't move. The mask had become part of her face. When they returned home, no one reacted, or maybe no one wanted to. The family acted as though nothing had changed, too calm, too quiet. Peppa sat at the dinner table, but her voice sounded muffled, like it was coming through glass. No one looked directly at her. The next day, the mirror behaved oddly. When Peppa turned her head, the reflection lagged behind. When she raised her hoof, the motion was off, as if someone inside the mirror was trying to mimic her but not quite managing. By the third day, she could barely feel her face. The mask didn't press, didn't itch. It simply was, still, silent. She tried to remember her old appearance, but the image blurred, like looking through foggy water. Her toys felt unfamiliar. The room looked wrong. Even her favorite blanket smelled different. Her clothes didn't fit right. Everything rubbed, tugged, shifted. She no longer felt at home in her own home. Time passed strangely, day after day, but it meant nothing. The house grew quieter, as if it were absorbing sound. Mummy and Daddy rarely spoke. They were present but distant and fading. Peppa began to hear whispering, not from outside, from within. A whisper without breath, without tone, repeating again and again, "You are the mask. You are me. You were." On the fourth day, the photographs changed. Faces faded. First George, then Daddy, then Peppa herself. The places where eyes and smiles used to be became pale, empty spots. Sometimes the mask itself changed, subtly, narrower, smoother, as if it was adjusting. Each time she looked in the mirror, she saw something unfamiliar, something staring back at her from the shadows, always silent. On the fifth day, the room had changed. No windows, walls blank like paper. The air was heavy, like she'd slept for too long. She woke up and didn't recognize anything. Nothing felt familiar, no toys, no books, no sound. In the middle of the floor lay the mask, dry, clean, and no longer on her. She couldn't remember who she was, didn't know why she stood up, didn't feel her own face. In the mirror across the room stood something that resembled Peppa, but the eyes were hollow, and inside them, silence. Peppa was gone. Only the shell remained, only the mask remained, waiting for a new face, a new game. Since then, some days, along the damp paths near the park, the mask can be seen again, lying neatly, dry, clean, and if anyone picks it up, they may hear a soft whisper from within.
Morning in Peppa Pig's house began differently than usual. She opened her eyes and immediately felt something was wrong. The room looked familiar, but the air was heavy, pressing, filled with a suffocating silence. George lay beside her, hugging his dinosaur, but she couldn't even hear his breathing. Peppa carefully got up and went downstairs. Normally, at this time, Mummy Pig would be making breakfast, and the house would be filled with the smell of porridge. But now, a different smell greeted her. Cold, empty, like a room where no one had lived for a very long time. Her family was waiting in the living room. Mummy, Daddy, and George sat on the sofa. They didn't move, they didn't speak. Their eyes were completely empty, like two black ovals, without reflection, without life. On their faces was the same wide, identical smile. They turned their heads toward Peppa all at once, and there was nothing natural in that movement. Peppa took a step back, and at that moment the television turned on by itself. The screen flickered, showed static, and then her reflection. Only it wasn't hers. The face on the screen was distorted, the eyes too big, the mouth twisted, and most terrifying of all, it didn't move the way she did. When Peppa blinked, the reflection kept staring with wide, unblinking eyes. When she raised her hoof, her copy did the same, but with a delay and at a strange angle, like a puppet pulled on strings. Sound filled the room. It wasn't a voice, and it wasn't music. It was a jumble of distorted phrases, spoken backwards. They overlapped, merging into a droning noise that made her ears ache. Peppa covered them with her hooves, but the sound continued inside her head. Her family stood up from the sofa and took a step forward. Their movements were synchronized, which made it even more terrifying. Peppa ran upstairs into her room and slammed the door shut. But the mirror in her bedroom was already waiting for her. Inside was the same copy from the screen. It was moving faster now, scratching at the glass with its hooves from the inside. Cracks spread across the surface, and its lips began to move. At first, silently. Then, through the crackling, she heard words, backwards and barely recognizable. "Let me in." The mirror splintered. In panic, Peppa pulled back, clutching the doorknob. And at that instant, everything fell silent again. The silence was thick, buzzing. She slowly went downstairs. The kitchen greeted her with a new, horrifying sight. Sitting right on the table was Labubu. Her favorite toy had always seemed harmless, but now it looked different. Its eyes were hollow, black, and its smile stretched too wide, as if the fabric of its face was ready to rip apart. In Labubu's paws was George's torn dinosaur. Threads hung from it, and the plastic body was twisted into an unnatural pose. Peppa froze, unable to move. Labubu slowly lifted its head. Its mouth didn't move, but a long hissing sound came from within. Then it stretched its tiny paw toward Peppa. Fear paralyzed her. She felt she couldn't scream, couldn't run. Labubu tilted its head slightly, as if saying, "You knew it would come to this." She felt the walls of the house begin to tremble. Lights flickered on in the corridor by themselves. Shadows stretched across the walls, too long, moving as if they were copying her every gesture. The television turned on again, and this time the distorted Peppa didn't just appear on the screen. It began to crawl halfway out. Its lips stretched into a grin, and it winked. Peppa covered her face with her hooves. She understood this day would not end. It would repeat again and again. And Labubu, sitting on the table, was there to make sure of it. His eyes glowed red. His smile stretched even wider. He was waiting. Peppa Pig. The second window. Peppa's room had always had one window. Everyone knew that. Peppa, Mummy Pig, Daddy Pig, even George. From that window she could see their yard, the swing, the flower bed. Everything was normal. But one morning, Peppa woke up and felt an unusual chill. She yawned, stretched, sat up in bed, and froze. On the other wall, there was a window, a second one. It had never been there before. Peppa jumped out of bed and walked up to it. It was narrower and taller than her usual window. The frame was dark, old, the glass cloudy like it had a layer of dust. Beyond it was a forest. Not their yard, not the street, a forest. Tall grey trees without leaves. A pale sky. Mist curling between the trunks. Peppa backed away. She looked through her usual window. There was their yard. George was playing with his dinosaur. Everything as it should be. She turned back to the second window. The forest. Still. But it felt like someone was hiding behind the trees, watching. "Mummy?" she called. Mummy Pig came up the stairs and entered the room. "Yes, Peppa? I have a window." "Of course you have a window," Mummy smiled. "Everything's fine." "No, not that one. Another one. There's a forest." Mummy looked where Peppa pointed. "There's a wall, sweetie," she said. "You probably had a dream. Try to sleep a little more." And she left. Peppa stayed alone. The window was still there. During the day she tried to forget, played with George, drew pictures. But when she returned to her room in the evening, the window had moved lower, almost level with her eyes. The forest was the same, but the mist was thicker, and there was a figure among the trees, black, still. The face was unclear. Peppa pulled the curtain shut, tight, and stayed away. At night, she woke up. The curtain had been pushed aside. A pale light shone from the window, and Peppa saw the figure had moved closer. It was now standing right at the glass. It didn't move, but now she could see the face. It looked like her, just stretched, eyes too wide, a thin, strange smile. Peppa screamed. Mummy ran in. The light came on. The window was gone. "You had another dream, darling," said Mummy. "Everything's all right." But Peppa didn't believe her. The next morning, the window was back, on a different wall. Every day it changed position, sometimes behind the bed, sometimes beside the door. The forest never changed. The figure kept getting closer. Peppa started leaving notes on the windowsill. "Who are you?" she wrote. But in the morning, they'd be gone. And one morning, words had been scratched into the glass from the inside. "You look out the window, but I'm inside." That day, Peppa didn't go to school. She sat in the corner of her room, by her normal window, breathing quietly. From behind her, a rustle. The curtain moved on its own. She didn't turn around. Now, the window is always there. But no one else sees it. Not Mummy, not Daddy. Even George says there's nothing there. And sometimes, at night, it opened. At night, Peppa opened her eyes. The house felt strange. The ceiling was cracked, the walls were damp, and the air was heavy and cold. Somewhere outside, the wind rustled, but it sounded wrong, like someone whispering. George was sitting nearby. He wasn't asleep. His eyes were wide open, staring into the dark. "George, what's wrong?" Peppa asked. He silently pointed toward the door. A dim light flickered in the hallway. Peppa carefully climbed down from her bed and followed her brother. The house was empty. There were no smells of Mummy Pig's cooking. The TV in the living room was off, and beyond the windows there was no garden, only endless fog. They walked slowly. The floorboards creaked under their feet and water dripped from the ceiling. When Peppa opened the bathroom door, she froze. Where the mirror used to hang, there was now a door, narrow, blue, as if painted right onto the tiles. "It wasn't here before," Peppa whispered. George stepped closer, reached out his little hoof, and touched the handle. The door opened. No creak, no sound. Just silently swung inward into a thick blue darkness. A cold draft came from within. George stepped through without looking back. The door closed behind him. Peppa was left alone. She knocked, called his name, but there was no answer. A few minutes later, the door opened again. George came out, covered in dust, as if he'd been somewhere ancient. His eyes looked empty. "Where were you?" Peppa asked. He whispered, "There, blue rooms." And a shadow. Its waiting Peppa didn't understand. George went to bed, but all night he tossed and turned, mumbling in his sleep. The next night, it happened again. The blue door appeared once more, and again, only George could open it. Peppa tried to grab his hoof, but her touch passed through the air, as though the door existed only for him. When he returned, his fur was no longer dusty but covered in soot. His eyes glowed faintly with an eerie light. He didn't want to talk. Only sometimes, he whispered, "La Boo Boo is inside." He's watching. Peppa began to notice strange things. The shadows in the corners of the room started to move on their own. The water in the sink looked dark, like a mirror. When she called George, he turned his head slowly, as if unsure who was speaking to him. "George, it's me, your sister," she said quietly. One night, Peppa woke up to the sound of footsteps. George was standing by her bed. His eyes shone with a cold blue light. In them, Peppa saw not their room, but a reflection of rippling water, as if inside his gaze was a river. In that murky water, shapes were moving. Peppa gasped. George smiled, but it wasn't his smile. "He's calling," he whispered. "He wants you to come too." Peppa ran to the bathroom. The blue door was there again, glowing faintly, as if lit from within. Moist air flowed from it, and on the floor shimmered a trembling reflection, like the surface of water. She didn't go closer. She knew if she opened it, she wouldn't come back. The next morning, the door was gone. Only a damp wall remained, and a dark hoofprint mark on the floor. George sat on his bed, calm, as if nothing had happened. "Where were you?" she asked. He smiled. "I'm already home." But when Peppa looked into his eyes, she thought she saw movement behind the reflection of the room, a blue shadow shaped like Labubu, sliding across his pupil before vanishing. Since then, Peppa has never seen the blue door again. But every night, when the house grows too quiet, somewhere deep within the walls, there comes a soft sound, as if someone is turning a blue handle once more. Spring in the pig family's house began with cleaning. Mummy Pig was washing the windows, Daddy Pig was vacuuming, and Peppa and George were dusting their toys. Everything was cheerful, until suddenly, from below, a strange sound echoed from the basement. It was a dull, scraping noise, like something heavy slowly rolling across the floor. "Daddy, did you hear that?" asked Peppa. Daddy Pig didn't respond, too busy tidying up. The sound came again, closer this time, accompanied by a long rustling. Curiosity took over, and Peppa pulled George by the hand. "Let's go see." Maybe something just fell. They opened the basement door. A wave of damp, dusty air rushed out. The stairs creaked under each step, and the lower they went, the colder it became. In the farthest corner, among old boxes, lay a round object that looked like a tire. It was covered in dust, but beneath the grime, faint wet spots glistened, as if alive. "What's that?" asked George. Peppa stepped closer. Something flickered in the center of the tire. She gasped. It was an eye, large, still, and cloudy, like a frog's. It blinked. The tire shuddered, turned slightly, and Peppa saw that underneath it were human legs, thin and grey, while from the top, emerging out of the shadows, was a frog-like head with a wide mouth and damp, rubbery skin. The creature stood motionless, staring straight at them. George clutched Peppa's hand. "Peppa, what is that?" It didn't move. Only a faint rhythmic whisper came from deep within the basement, as if someone were chanting meaningless words. "Ambalabu, ambalabu." Peppa stepped back. "We have to go." But the staircase behind them was gone. In its place hung a thick grey mist. The air grew heavy, almost sticky. A thin vapor rose from the tire, spreading around them. The world began to tremble. The floor disappeared beneath their feet, and the walls melted away, turning into clouds of fog. When the trembling stopped, they were no longer at home. Peppa and George stood in an empty space with no ceiling or floor. Glowing shadows floated slowly in the air, as if the objects themselves had come to life. Toys, shelves, furniture, everything drifted weightlessly, like in a dream. And in the middle of that strange void, it appeared again. Boneka Ambalabu. Now it was moving, slowly rolling forward like a living tire, leaving behind a wet trail. Its human legs walked on nothing, and its eyeless gaze gleamed faintly through the fog. The creature tilted its head, and from its mouth came a quiet, drawn-out rasping sound. It was like a melody, the warped tune of an old music box, stretched beyond recognition. "I want to go home," whispered George. Peppa looked around. On the ground beside them stood the same music box that started it all. It trembled slightly, as if calling them. "Wind it up," said Peppa. George turned the handle. The melody played again, uneven, distorted. The creature twitched, stretched upward, and its outline began to fade into the mist. The world around them glowed with a pale, ghostly light. For a moment, it felt like they were returning. The air thickened, familiar. Through the mist, the shapes of boxes and shelves emerged once more. But when Peppa opened her eyes, they weren't home. The room looked almost the same, but colder, dimmer. Everything seemed drained of color. "Mummy? Daddy?" called Peppa. No answer, only the echo of her voice, repeating again and again, softer each time. On the floor sat the music box. It was closed. Peppa approached and touched it. From inside came the same whisper. Ambalabu. She slowly stepped back, holding George's hand. The whisper repeated. Now it came from behind them. They turned. In the shadow of the stairs stood Boneka Ambalabu, still, silent. Only its eyes reflected the faint light, as if waiting for the melody to start again. An ordinary day in Peppa Pig's house passed quietly and almost unnoticed. But Peppa herself immediately noticed. Her little brother George was different. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't running around the house like he usually did. Even his favorite dinosaur lay forgotten in the corner, unwanted. George sat by the window, staring into the grey sky, silent. His eyes seemed empty, as if he wasn't looking at anything at all but falling into a bottomless void. "George?" Peppa asked carefully. "Are you all right?" But he didn't answer. He only slowly turned his head to his sister and gave her a faint smile. That smile wasn't warm. It had no joy, no trace of his usual childish innocence. A chill ran down Peppa's spine. At dinner that evening, he barely ate. Their parents tried to talk, but George replied only in single words, or not at all. Peppa noticed that Mummy and Daddy seemed not to see anything strange. They behaved as if George had always been this quiet and distant. Days passed. Each time Peppa found her brother, he was in a different place, out in the garden, by the window, in the hallway, and every time he just sat there, unmoving, as if waiting for something. His eyes grew emptier with each passing day. Peppa tried to play with him, but he never reacted. Sometimes she caught his stare, long, unblinking, foreign. And then, one evening, Peppa noticed George quietly rise and walk to the door. His steps were slow and steady, as though he knew exactly where he was going. "George, wait!" Peppa called, but he didn't turn back. She ran after him. Outside, drizzle filled the air, cold and heavy. George walked straight toward the forest behind their house. Peppa's heart pounded in her chest faster and faster, but she couldn't stop herself. Curiosity and fear pushed her forward. Deep in the woods stood an old hut. Peppa had never seen it before, even though she'd played in these woods many times. The door hung half open and cold air seeped out. George stepped inside, and after a brief hesitation, Peppa followed him. Inside, it was dark, smelling of dust and mold. The floorboards creaked beneath her feet. George stood in the center of the room. Slowly, he turned toward her. His eyes were utterly lifeless, like two bottomless pits. A wide, unnatural smile was frozen on his face. "I'm not George anymore," he whispered. His voice was low, hollow, as if it belonged to someone else. Peppa's knees went weak. She stumbled backward, but George melted into the darkness, vanishing as if he had never been there. The room filled with silence, so heavy that her ears rang. Terrified, Peppa ran out of the hut, tripping and stumbling until she reached home. She burst into the hallway, gasping for air, her heart hammering. But when she looked into George's room, she froze. He was there, sitting on the floor, playing with his blocks, as if nothing had happened. He was even humming a soft tune. "George," Peppa whispered. He lifted his head. His eyes were just as empty, his smile just as dreadful. That night, Peppa tossed and turned in bed, unable to sleep. She listened to every sound in the house, and then she heard it. First a faint rustle, then a quiet scraping. It was coming from under her bed. Peppa slowly leaned over and peeked beneath. There sat Labubu, her favorite toy. But now, he didn't look the same. His eyes glowed red in the darkness, reflecting the dim light from the window. His smile was stretched far too wide, so distorted it looked as though the fabric of his face had split apart. In his tiny hands, Labubu held a figure. Peppa's heart stopped when she recognized it. It was George, a small, pale copy of her brother with empty eyes and lifeless skin. Labubu raised the figure to his face. His glowing eyes flared brighter, and his smile twisted into something almost inhuman. "He is mine now," he whispered in a low, alien voice. Peppa recoiled, clutching her blanket, squeezing her eyes shut. She prayed it was only a dream. But when she opened them again, Labubu was still there. In his hands, the figure of George remained. Peppa understood. It was him. It was Labubu who had changed George. He had stolen his soul, and now he wouldn't stop. George was only the beginning. The house grew quiet, too quiet. Even her parents in recent days seemed to have forgotten their younger child. When Peppa asked about him, they only gave her long, blank looks and replied, "We've only ever had you." And in that moment, Peppa realized the most terrible truth. Labubu hadn't just taken George. He had begun erasing him. He was sinking deeper and deeper into their house, into their family, into reality itself. And at night, sitting on the shelf in Peppa's room, Labubu smiled faintly. His red eyes glowed dimly in the darkness, and Peppa knew soon he would come for her too.